What if the oldest story we've ever told wasn't the beginning at all? What if it was only the last echo of something far older? Beneath the deserts of southern Iraq, fragments of clay from 5,000 years ago still whisper in a language that shouldn't exist. They called themselves the black-headed people, the Sumerians, and when archaeologists first unearthed their tablets in the late 19th century, they discovered something extraordinary. This wasn't a civilization learning to write, struggling toward knowledge, slowly building the foundations of culture. This was a civilization that appeared fully formed, already literate, already sophisticated, already charting the movements of planets that shouldn't have been visible to the naked eye. Their texts speak of rulers who reigned for tens of thousands of years, and their myths describe beings who descended from the sky to teach humanity. So settle in. Tonight we're listening to the oldest voice in human history, and it's telling us we weren't the first. The earliest Sumerian records appear as if from nowhere around 3500 BCE, with no slow evolution leading to them. Their language was fully formed, their city plans geometrically aligned, their astronomical charts already precise. They built temples, ziggurats, irrigation systems, and mathematical frameworks that still form the bones of our calendar today. It was as if the curtain had suddenly lifted on a civilization that began in full bloom, then faded as mysteriously as it had appeared. Scholars have long struggled to explain that suddenness. History prefers slow progress, gradual invention, one tool leading to the next. Agricultural settlements evolving into villages, villages into towns, towns into cities, each step building naturally on what came before, but the Sumerians complicate that rhythm. When archaeologists uncovered the city of Uruk, they expected crude beginnings. Instead, they found city walls stretching 6 miles, monumental temples aligned with celestial points, and evidence of advanced metallurgy. Buried beneath one ziggurat, they unearthed a library of over 40,000 clay tablets, a civilization that documented itself in extraordinary detail, yet left us with more questions than answers. How did they learn so much so quickly? Where did their mathematics, based on 60, not 10, come from? Why did they map the heavens with such familiarity, as though they were remembering rather than discovering? Imagine holding one of those tablets in your palm. Its wedge-shaped impressions still carry the pulse of a hand that lived before every empire we know. The writing system, cuneiform, was not merely an alphabet, but a geometry of meaning. Triangles, lines, and cuts, each arranged to hold both sound and symbol. Through these marks, they recorded medicine, trade, hymns, contracts, and even star movements. One tablet lists the phases of Venus with a precision we only confirmed with modern telescopes. Another describes the paths of Jupiter and Mars in detail that shouldn't have been possible without instruments they didn't possess. But perhaps the strangest aspect of their arrival is the language itself. Sumerian is what linguists call a language isolate. It has no known relatives, no parent tongue, no evolutionary path. Every other ancient language, Akkadian, Hebrew, Egyptian, fits into linguistic families, but Sumerian stands alone. It appeared complete, structured, sophisticated, as if it had been transplanted from somewhere else entirely. The Sumerians called their writing emegir, which translates literally as the true speech, or the language of origin. It's as though they themselves remembered their words as inherited, not invented. They called writing ami, the voice made permanent. To write was not simply to record, it was to preserve vibration, to trap sound in matter, and perhaps that was why they pressed their words into clay instead of ink, because clay endures, as if the earth itself were meant to be the keeper of their voice. The cities themselves tell the same strange story. Eridu, considered by archaeologists to be the oldest city in southern Mesopotamia, shows layer upon layer of construction dating back almost 8,000 years. Temples rebuilt upon older temples, each one slightly smaller than the one before, as if mimicking the slow contraction of time itself. The Sumerians called Eridu the first city. In their stories, it was founded by the god Enki, the keeper of knowledge, the one who shaped humanity from clay. Excavations there reveal evidence of a complex water system, ritual altars, and artifacts made of materials that shouldn't have existed in that region. stones from distant mountains, shells from the Indian Ocean, a trade network, or a remnant of something older, perhaps both. What unsettles scholars most is how advanced this civilization was from its very first appearance. There is no evidence of evolution from simpler forms. No Proto-Sumerian, no experimental inscriptions leading up to cuneiform. The earliest tablets, dating from 3300 BCE, already use a standardized script consistent across cities separated by hundreds of miles. That kind of uniformity implies not invention, but transmission. Someone taught them how to write, but who? The Sumerians themselves credited their writing to Nisaba, the goddess of wisdom and scribes. She's always depicted holding a stylus and a tablet, the tools of knowledge. Yet her name also means the one who counts the stars. Perhaps to them writing was not only language, but measurement, a way of inscribing cosmic order into human form. In the Museum of the Ancient Near East in Berlin, a small clay cylinder rests behind glass. The markings on its surface describe the building of a temple in honor of Inanna, the goddess of love and war. But among the dedication lines, one sentence stands out. This is the restoration of what was before. Restoration. A word that implies memory, not invention. It's a quiet confession that even the Sumerians saw themselves as heirs to something older. Sometimes, when you look closely at these artifacts, you notice fingerprints pressed into the clay before it dried, the print of a scribe who may have lived 6,000 years ago, a pulse frozen in mud. And if you trace that ridge with your eyes, you realize those hands might have written down the last surviving fragments of an age erased by flood, time, or perhaps intention. The silence between those lines feels heavy, as if something vast had been taken away. The same way a missing note can haunt an entire song. The same way a lost memory hovers at the edge of sleep. There's something almost eerie in the way Sumerian civilization simply stops as well. By 2000 BCE, the language had ceased to be spoken in daily life. The cities fell to invaders, were abandoned, or slowly buried beneath wind-blown sand. Yet for more than 1,000 years after that, Babylonian scribes continued to copy and study Sumerian texts as holy relics. They treated the language like scripture. In temple schools called adubas, young scribes memorized long bilingual lists, Akkadian on one side, Sumerian on the other, so that the sacred tongue would not be lost. Imagine that. Generations of students labouring over a language no one spoke, reciting the dead syllables of their ancestors as prayer. Perhaps they sensed what we do now, that something vital resided in that ancient speech, something that once connected humankind to a deeper understanding of itself. When modern scholars began deciphering Sumerian in the 19th century, they felt something uncanny, a sense of déjà vu, as if they were not discovering but remembering. One of them, Henry Rawlinson, wrote in his diary, "This script awakens something in me, like hearing a language I once knew in a dream." Maybe that is what Sumerian truly is, the dream language of humanity, a remnant of our first articulation, our first self-awareness. It shouldn't exist, and yet it does, quietly defying the logic of history. But the mystery deepens when you look at what the Sumerians actually wrote, because they didn't just record grain inventories and legal contracts. They documented something far stranger, a history that reaches back into impossible timescales and speaks of knowledge that shouldn't have been available to people living 5,000 years ago. They spoke of a time before kings, before floods, when knowledge was given. They named their teachers not as men, but as gods descending from the sky. And though such language was later dressed in myth, its foundation feels older than metaphor. One of the most haunting aspects of Sumerian culture is how they viewed themselves. In their hymns and lamentations, there's a tone of longing, a sense that something magnificent once existed, and everything after was merely its shadow. When the Sumerians built their temples, they weren't acts of ambition. They were acts of remembrance. They were rebuilding, not beginning. You can almost hear that longing in their hymns, songs to gods who no longer answered, invocations to ancestors turned to dust. In one fragmentary text, a scribe writes, "I saw the stone temples of the deep, their doors sealed by the waters. I saw lights beneath the sea that never fade." Scholars translate it as metaphor, but its imagery echoes across mythologies. The submerged realms, the lost cities, the knowledge beneath the waves. The Greeks called it Atlantis. The Egyptians spoke of Zep Tepi, the first time. The Sumerians simply called it before the flood. Perhaps they were all remembering the same event, fragmented through the lenses of geography and time. At night, when the museums close and the lights fade, I imagine those clay tablets breathing in the dark, each one holding the faint memory of a world we no longer recognize. We think we are the beginning of understanding, but maybe we are the last chapter of remembrance. And as the desert wind passes over the ruins of Uruk, carrying grains of ancient dust into another millennium, you can almost hear the first line of our forgotten story, soft, unfinished, waiting to be heard again. If the Sumerians were not the first, then who were they remembering? The answer may lie in the strangest document they ever left behind. A text so puzzling that scholars still argue over what it means more than a century after its discovery. It's called the Sumerian King List, and it speaks of rulers who reigned not for decades but for tens of thousands of years. 8 kings before the flood, the text says. Their reigns measured in epochs that dwarf human lifespans, and then the waters swept over the land and everything began again. This wasn't mythology written by poets, this was a bureaucratic record written in the same hand that tallied grain, debts and temple offerings. To the Sumerians, this list was memory, not myth, and that distinction haunts everything about it. They said kingship descended from heaven, not metaphorically, not symbolically, but as a statement of fact. After the kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. It is the opening verse of what we now call the Sumerian King List, a chronicle of rulers whose reigns stretch far beyond the boundaries of human possibility. On the surface, it reads like a historical document, cities, names, dates. But as the list continues, the numbers become impossible. One king ruled for 36,000 years, another for 28,000, another for 43,200. In total, 8 rulers governed the world before a great flood swept over the land. Only after that flood does the record shrink into something more human. Reigns of hundreds of years, then decades. Scholars have tried for centuries to decode what those impossible numbers mean. Were they symbolic, astronomical, allegorical, or were they preserving a time when the scale of life itself was different? There's something unsettling in that question, something that makes the air around these tablets feel heavier, because these weren't idle stories. They were bureaucratic records, written in the same hand that tallied grain, debts, and temple offerings. To the Sumerians, this list was memory, not myth, and that distinction haunts everything about it. The earliest copies of the King List were found in the ruins of Lhasa and Nippur. Each version differs slightly, as though translated from a memory that was already fading. Yet the structure remains constant, 8 kings before the flood. Their reigns measured in tens of thousands of years, followed by a cosmic reset. Then new kings arise, Uruk, Kish, each claiming divine mandate, each tracing legitimacy back to that pre-Diluvian age. Some historians argue that these numbers reflect lunar cycles, or perhaps a symbolic calendar meant to convey divine authority. But others, those who linger too long on the strange precision of Sumerian mathematics, notice that the numbers correspond to multiples of 3,600, the Sumerian unit known as the Sa. This wasn't random, it was the same system used to measure orbits, star cycles, and cosmic distances. Why would a royal chronicle be encoded in astronomical notation, unless the kings themselves were meant to be read as celestial beings, rulers of epochs rather than years? The King List is one of those artifacts that feels like it shouldn't exist. It bridges myth and history so seamlessly that scholars still argue over which side it belongs to. The names of these ancient rulers, Alulim, Alalgar, Enmen, Luana, don't appear anywhere else in Sumerian records, and yet the cities they ruled do. Eridu, for instance, is real. considered by archaeologists to be the oldest city in southern Mesopotamia. Under its ruins, they found layer upon layer of construction dating back almost 8,000 years. Temples rebuilt upon older temples, each one slightly smaller than the one before, as if mimicking the slow contraction of time itself. The Sumerians called Eridu the first city. In their stories, it was founded by the god Enki, the keeper of knowledge, the one who shaped humanity from clay. When the king list describes the flood that ended the reigns of the ancient kings, it uses language eerily similar to later texts. Then the flood swept over, no explanation, no divine judgment, just an event that resets time. Beneath the ruins of Ur, archaeologists in the 1920s uncovered a layer of clean, sterile silt, nearly 2 meters thick, evidence of a massive flood around 2900 BCE. It buried everything beneath it, sealing one age beneath another. It is tempting to read this as proof, though proof is never what these stories truly offer. They offer suggestion, shadow, memory. In the quiet of a museum, standing before the king list tablet, you might notice how deliberate each wedge mark is. There's no hesitation. Whoever wrote it believed in the precision of every number, and yet it feels as though the writer was transcribing something even older, something handed down through generations that no longer understood its origin. The strangeness deepens when you realize that nearly every ancient culture shares an echo of this same sequence. Divine rulers, catastrophic flood, new beginning. The Egyptian Turin, papyrus lists gods and demigods ruling before human pharaohs. The Hindu Puranas describe vast yugas, ages lasting tens of thousands of years, ending in flood and fire. The Mayan Chilambalam speaks of earlier worlds destroyed by water and time. Always the same pattern, rule from the sky, a fall into chaos, rebirth through flood. It's as though humanity remembers the rhythm but not the melody. The details change, the names shift, yet the structure remains. A half-remembered dream repeated across continents. Some researchers, like Zechariah Sitchin, argued that the king list preserves a record of beings who weren't entirely human, those who came from the stars, taught humanity, and ruled until the flood removed them. His interpretations, though controversial, found resonance because the questions the tablets raise refused to die. Even traditional archaeologists, while rejecting the extraterrestrial hypothesis, admit that the origin of Sumerian civilization is an anomaly, a spark without a match. Others see in the list an encoded scientific calendar. The long reigns may represent precession cycles or cosmic epochs. If the reign of Alulim lasted 28,800 years, perhaps it marked a celestial alignment, a rhythm of the heavens mirrored on earth. The Sumerians often blurred the boundaries between sky and soil. Their gods were the planets themselves, their myths the language of orbit and light. Maybe the king list was less a record of rule and more a map of cosmic order, a record of the time before time. Still, the emotional weight of it cannot be ignored. Beneath all the numbers and theories, there is grief in these tablets, a sense that something magnificent once existed, and that everything after was merely its shadow. When the flood swept over, the old world died, and memory became myth. The Sumerians built their temples as acts of remembrance, not ambition. They were rebuilding, not beginning. In one of the surviving lines, after the flood, the text reads simply, "Then kingship was again lowered from heaven," as if history itself is cyclical, descending and withdrawing like the tide. Each age, each civilization, each rise and fall, just another attempt to remember what was lost the first time. Perhaps that's why we still search the desert for their traces, not to find answers, but to feel that rhythm again, the slow pulse of a world older than history. But what were those 8 kings ruling over? What kind of world existed before the flood that could sustain such impossibly long reigns? The king list offers no details, just names and numbers, cold and absolute. Yet embedded in other Sumerian texts are glimpses of that pre-flood world. fragments of description that suggest it was vastly different from anything that came after. In the Eridu Genesis, one of the oldest flood narratives ever written, the world before the deluge is described as a time when the gods lived among men. Cities were large, knowledge was abundant, the heavens and earth were still connected. Then came the noise. Humanity, the text says, grew too numerous, too loud. The clamour disturbed the gods. And so Enlil, the god of air and storms, decreed that the world must be silenced. A flood would come, the waters would rise, and everything would be washed away. But Enki, the god of wisdom and water, could not bear to see humanity destroyed completely. In secret, he warned a man named Ziusudra, a king and priest of the city of Shuruppak. Build a vessel, Enki told him, of strong walls and sealed pitch. Take into it the seed of all living things. Then the rain began. For 7 days and nights the world vanished beneath the flood. When the waters receded, Ziusudra opened a window and released a dove. It did not return. He knew the earth had emerged again. In gratitude, he offered sacrifice. The gods, moved, or perhaps regretful, granted him immortality and placed him in the land beyond the rivers. This story predates the biblical flood by over a millennium. Its bones are the same: divine wrath, chosen survivor, vessel of life, renewal. Yet the Sumerian version carries no moral lesson, no condemnation of sin. It reads instead like a geological memory, a record of an event so profound that it burned itself into the human timeline. Archaeology, cautious as ever, hesitates to affirm such myths, and yet beneath the ruins of ancient Mesopotamian cities, there is evidence that something like the Sumerian flood did happen. In the 1920s, Sir Leonard Woolley excavated and discovered a deep layer of sterile silt, clean river mud nearly 2 meters thick, sandwiched between layers of habitation. He found similar deposits at Kish and Shuruppak. The dating corresponded roughly to 2900 BCE. Woolley described it simply: a flood of such magnitude that it destroyed life and left the land empty. The people who rebuilt afterward did so as if they were starting anew. To modern minds, it may sound like coincidence, one local disaster among many, but to those who lived it, it must have felt like the end of the world. The rivers Tigris and Euphrates, swollen by rains and melting snows, may have combined with tidal surges from the Persian Gulf. Or perhaps the memory reaches even farther back, to the violent end of the last ice age, when meltwater floods reshaped entire continents. In every corner of the ancient world, the same pattern persists: myths of great waters, survivors in boats, the rebirth of humankind. From India's Manu to the Greek Deucalion, from the Aztec Coxcox to the biblical Noah, the story repeats like a scar in the collective mind. The Sumerians, though, described it not merely as disaster, but as transition. The flood was the dividing line between the antediluvian kings, those mysterious rulers who reigned for tens of thousands of years, and the mortal kings who came after. It was the veil between myth and history. Before the flood, the gods walked openly among men. Afterward, they withdrew. The connection between heaven and earth was severed. Humanity was left to remember, and to misremember. Some tablets hint that the flood was not entirely natural. In one fragment, the gods debate among themselves: should humankind be destroyed? Enlil, weary of the noise of cities, argues for annihilation. Enki pleads for mercy, seeking another way. It is a dialogue of opposing forces: order and compassion, control and chaos. When the deluge comes, it feels less like accident and more like decision. The phrase used to describe it, the great decree, suggests intention. The flood was not just water, it was judgment. Others have seen in this story traces of something even more complex, a metaphor for cycles of civilization. Perhaps the flood was not a literal inundation, but a symbolic description of an event that reset human culture: a comet impact, a shift in climate, a collapse of knowledge. Geological evidence hints at sudden sea level rises and cosmic impacts near the end of the Pleistocene. To the survivors, it would have seemed like divine punishment, incomprehensible power, and so they remembered it as a cleansing, one that washed away both sin and science. If the flood erased a former world, then every artifact the Sumerians later buried was a fragment of that forgotten age. Their writing, their mathematics, their star charts, each feels like an attempt to retrieve something half-remembered. They were not inventing civilization. They were rebuilding after the water. Even their myths read like recovery manuals. The god Enki, saviour of humanity, teaches the survivors how to plant, how to measure, how to keep time. Knowledge, in their view, was not discovery, but restoration. In the poem, The Return of Inanna, the goddess descends to the underworld and rises again after 3 days, bringing fertility back to the land. The Sumerians may have seen the flood in similar terms: descent into chaos, return to life. Yet beneath the spiritual allegory lingers a geological memory. Something happened, something vast enough to fracture both land and legend. There is a line from the Epic of Gilgamesh that feels almost like a confession. Utnapishtim, the flood survivor, tells Gilgamesh, "What you call the gods were once men of great name. They remembered the secrets of the deep." It is a strange sentence, one that suggests that divinity and humanity are not separate species, but states of memory. The flood did not just drown the earth, it drowned that memory. What remained was the echo. Even today, when rain falls over the plains of southern Iraq, it is said that the soil releases a faint metallic scent, as though the ground itself recalls the sea that once covered it. In that scent lies the residue of the ancient catastrophe, the flood that ended an era and began another, and perhaps the Sumerian sense that such cycles never truly end. Every civilization, no matter how advanced, eventually meets its flood, whether of water, fire, or forgetfulness. To the ancients, survival was not victory, it was responsibility. Ziusudra was not rewarded with paradise, but exile, sent to dwell in the distance, to remember what others would forget. The flood was both punishment and preservation, ensuring that at least one thread of memory would remain. That thread wound its way into every myth that followed, binding the ages together like sedimentary layers of story. When the Sumerians wrote of the deluge, they weren't warning us. They were reminding themselves that the gods, or perhaps nature itself, always demands silence after too much noise. And in that silence, humanity must learn again how to begin. There is a quiet kind of awe that comes from realizing how much the ancients knew about the sky, not as an abstraction, not as a canvas of wonder, but as a system they seem to have already mapped long before telescopes existed. The Sumerians didn't just look upward, they measured, recorded, and aligned their world according to what they saw. Their temples were built in exact orientation with celestial paths. Their gods were the planets. Their calendar followed the intricate rhythms of Venus and Jupiter with a precision we would only rediscover thousands of years later. And somehow this knowledge appeared not at the end of a long learning curve, but at the very beginning. If you walk among the ruins of Ur or Nippur and stand where the ziggurats once reached toward the horizon, the geometry of their foundations reveals something uncanny. Every major temple faces an astronomical point, the rising of a particular star, the solstice line, the place where Venus appears at dawn. The great ziggurat of Ur, for example, is aligned almost perfectly to the north, with corners facing the cardinal directions. A feat of architectural awareness that implies both mathematical skill and celestial observation. Yet these structures were built nearly 6,000 years ago, at a time when most of the world still lived in scattered tribes. Among the thousands of tablets excavated from Mesopotamia, a small subset record something unexpected: systematic star charts, the so-called Muld-Apine tablets, believed to date from the old Babylonian period, but preserving far older Sumerian knowledge, list constellations, equinoxes, solstices, and the rising and setting times of the planets. Some scholars believe the observations encoded there could date back to around 3000 BCE, possibly earlier. How could they know the exact cycle of Venus, 584.92 days, with an error margin of less than a single day? Modern science, with all its instruments, calculates the precession of the equinox at roughly 1 degree every 72 years. But in ancient Sumer, inscriptions already reflect an understanding of this slow drift of the stars. To measure that, one would need centuries of continuous observation, or inherited records from a civilization that had already observed them. The Sumerians left us neither telescopes nor formal explanations, only myth. But their myths speak in the language of data. The goddess Inanna, associated with Venus, was said to descend into the underworld and rise again, her story mirroring the planet's disappearance and reappearance in the sky. The god, Nanna, the moon, was the keeper of cycles. His temple was called the Observatory of the Seven Great Gods, corresponding to the 7 classical planets visible to the naked eye. Even the term Anunnaki, often translated as those who from heaven to earth came, carries a double resonance. Mythological beings, yes, but also the counted ones of Anu, a phrase that in Sumerian also means the numbered heavenly bodies. It is tempting to read too much into coincidence, yet the consistency of these patterns across cities and epochs suggests intent, not accident. Each temple, each ritual, each festival date reflected the turning of the heavens. They didn't separate religion from science or myth from observation. For them, the universe was a single breathing system, its motion sacred, its numbers divine. But where did this awareness begin? Did a people just emerging from the Neolithic Revolution truly develop such refined astronomy alone? In 1899, the German archaeologist Hugo Winkler uncovered tablets at Boğazkale in Anatolia, texts that linked Sumerian star lore to the later Hittites and Chaldeans. What's striking is the continuity, the same constellations, the same patterns of planetary worship, transmitted for millennia with barely any change. Such precision doesn't usually survive oral tradition. It survives through written record or preserved systems of instruction. Which means the Sumerians were not inventing astronomy. They were documenting something already known. In one tablet from Nineveh's library, now kept in the British Museum, a scribe had carefully drawn the path of Jupiter across the night sky, using a complex mathematical system that modern astronomers recognized as a rudimentary form of calculus. Another tablet describes the shadow of the Earth across the moon during an eclipse, noting that the god is devoured but returns. Beneath the poetry lies recognition of orbit and geometry, and when these same scribes referred to the heavens as the tablets of destiny, they weren't being poetic. They were speaking the literal truth of their worldview, that the stars recorded fate. There's something almost eerie in that. A civilization born out of mud and reed huts, whose farmers depended on the flooding of rivers, writing about the mathematical precision of the cosmos as if they had already mastered it, and maybe, in a sense, they had. Some researchers see in their 12-based numbering system a reflection of the 12 major constellations of the zodiac, the division of the sky that we still use today. Others point to the Sumerian obsession with the number 60, found everywhere in their measurements, as evidence of astronomical encoding, 60 minutes, 60 seconds, 360 degrees. Even our modern clocks still echo their design. The very rhythm of our timekeeping is inherited from theirs. And then there are the stories that unsettle even the most cautious scholars. In a series of tablets from Shipar, the god Enki instructs humankind in the measures of the heavens, teaching them to build instruments to see that which cannot be seen. Another fragment describes a chamber of glass that magnifies the eyes. Some interpret this as metaphor, others as lost technology, a poetic memory of lenses or primitive telescopes. Indeed, small rock crystal lenses have been found in Mesopotamian sites, though their purpose remains debated. Were they ornaments or tools of observation? The more we read, the harder it becomes to separate their cosmology from ours. The Sumerians didn't just watch the sky. They believed it was alive. Each planet had a will, a personality, an orbit that mirrored moral order. The movement of the stars was not mechanical, but spiritual, yet their records of it remain mathematically consistent. Somehow they managed to hold myth and measurement in the same breath, without contradiction. Maybe that's what modernity lost, the ability to see precision and wonder as one thing. If we could ask a Sumerian priest astronomer how he knew what he knew, he might simply say it was given. And perhaps he would not mean by gods of flesh or fire, but by something received through observation, ritual, patience, and memory. Yet even that explanation leaves something unspoken, because their knowledge feels too vast for their context, too deliberate for mere chance. Was this the residue of a forgotten epoch, an inheritance from people who had already charted the heavens before the flood? Or is it simply proof that humanity's genius has always been older than we imagine? Either way, when the sun sets over the ruins of Ur and the first stars ignite over the desert, it's easy to believe the Sumerians are still watching. Their geometry remains, etched into the earth. The angles of their temples still catch the light of the same stars they once recorded. Their myths still move with the rhythm of planetary orbits, and somewhere in that rhythm lies a memory of a time when science and divinity were the same language. The gods who measured the heavens may have been only men, or perhaps the men who watched the heavens became gods in the act of measuring. If they inherited their knowledge, then from whom? Across thousands of Sumerian tablets, one phrase recurs again and again: Anunnaki, those who from heaven to earth came. The words have been read, debated, dismissed, and reinterpreted for over a century, but their simplicity remains haunting. To the Sumerians, the Anunnaki were not abstract gods carved from imagination. They were rulers, judges, and teachers, beings of immense power who shaped humanity's fate. Their names are inscribed beside the earliest star charts, their symbols embedded in royal seals, their actions recorded as history, not legend. And though later civilizations softened them into myth, the oldest texts speak of their presence with an unsettling matter-of-factness, as though memory had not yet learned how to lie. The Anunnaki appear first in the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic that draws directly from Sumerian sources. There they are described as the 50 great gods, attendants of Anu, the Sky Father. But in older Sumerian hymns their number shifts, sometimes 7, sometimes hundreds. More a classification than a count. They dwell in the heavens, yet descend to the earth. They govern time, justice, kingship, and the order of the stars. Their leader, Anu, resides in the distant heavens. Enlil commands the air and storms. Enki rules the deep waters, the Abzu beneath the earth. Between them moves a pantheon that feels less like a family of deities and more like a council of administrators, each assigned a domain, each responsible for maintaining the balance between heaven and earth. What makes the Anunnaki so enigmatic is the tone with which the Sumerians wrote of them. These were not beings to be worshipped blindly. They were revered, feared, obeyed, but also questioned. The poems describe arguments among the gods, rivalries, even moral conflicts. They are portrayed as powerful, but not omniscient. Mortal, perhaps not in body, but in motive. The boundaries between divinity and humanity are blurred. The Anunnaki do not merely create mankind, they interact with it. They guide, instruct, and at times punish. Some of the oldest inscriptions, such as those from the city of Lagos, depict these beings with wings, not as angelic metaphors, but as markers of flight. In reliefs and cylinder seals, they stand beside trees of life, holding strange devices that resemble wristbands and pouches. They face human figures, instructing them, measuring them. These details have fueled generations of speculation. To some, the imagery is symbolic, an artistic shorthand for spiritual power. To others, it suggests a literal truth, that the Sumerians were recording encounters with beings whose origins lay beyond the earth. The theory is controversial, of course. Zecharia Sitchin, in the 20th century, would make the Anunnaki famous again by interpreting their myths as the memory of ancient visitors from another world. He read the old word Anu not just as sky, but as a physical realm, a planet. He argued that the Sumerians inherited knowledge of astronomy, metallurgy, and genetics from these visitors. That humanity itself was a hybrid creation. Most scholars rejected his translations, calling them imaginative rather than accurate. Yet even among the critics, the question lingered. Why did the Sumerians, of all people, know so much about the heavens? They described planets invisible to the naked eye. They mapped the precession of the equinoxes, the orbit of the moon, and the 12-fold division of the zodiac. They called Earth Kai, the lower world, and referred to a crossing place of the gods, Nibiru, a celestial body whose arrival marked upheaval and renewal. Whether or not Sitchin's planetary theories hold, the linguistic fact remains. Nibiru does appear in their texts, described as the star or planet which crosses the paths of all others. To the ancient mind, that crossing was divine movement, the descent of the Watchers. But even if we strip away modern speculation, something extraordinary remains. The Sumerians recorded the idea of the Elu, the divine observer who sees the deeds of men and writes them upon the tablets of heaven. This concept appears centuries before the notion of guardian angels, centuries before divine judgment entered theology. The Watchers were both protectors and witnesses. They did not rule from afar. They documented. Humanity, in their eyes, was an experiment worth preserving, in record. One hymn from calls them, those who look down upon the lands from the shining chariots of Anu. Another speaks of the fire that descends with them, lighting the earth. Scholars translate these passages metaphorically as thunder as lightning. Yet the repetition of light descent and observation across unrelated tablets hints at more than storm imagery. The word Jira, translated as divine flame, was also used to denote metal or craft. The ancients may have been describing technologies they could not fully name. The interplay between myth and memory is delicate. The Sumerians may have seen in the Anunnaki not literal visitors, but the embodiment of cosmic order, the planets themselves, the forces of nature personified. Enki, lord of the deep, mirrors the watery abyss. Enlil, lord of air, the invisible atmosphere. Anu, the unreachable sky. Yet why then did they write as though these beings once walked among them? Why did they leave genealogies, treaties and laws supposedly dictated by their divine kings? In the lamentation over Eridu, a city said to have been the first home of the gods, the poet mourns. The lords have departed, the houses are silent, their voices are gone from the wind. The tone is not mythic, it is historical, almost documentary. It is the grief of a people remembering the withdrawal of something real. Perhaps the Anunnaki were once simply rulers, great kings mythologized over time, their deeds magnified into divinity. Perhaps they were the memory of a lost civilization, elevated by reverence into godhood. But there is another possibility, quieter, harder to dismiss, that the Sumerians experienced something they could not explain, and myth was the only language they had to describe it. Whatever their nature, the Anunnaki left a legacy that outlived Sumer. The idea of sky beings who descended to instruct humanity spread across continents. The Egyptians spoke of the Neteru, divine visitors who founded their dynasties. The Hindus told of the Devas descending from the heavens. The Mayans remembered Itzamna, who came from the stars to teach writing and time, all different names, all carrying the same pattern, beings who came, taught, and vanished. Maybe these are just parallel inventions, the shared dreams of early humanity seeking meaning in the unknown sky. Or maybe they're cultural memories of the same event, refracted through geography and time. If so, then Sumer's Anunnaki were not just their gods. They were humanity's first remembered teachers. The tablets end where the mystery begins. They record the moment when the Watchers left, when the link between heaven and earth was broken. After that, the Sumerians say, kingship descended once more from the heavens, but the gods themselves did not return. Humanity was left to rule itself, guided only by the shadows of their memory. We still look up, searching for them in the stars, not knowing whether we're remembering the past or imagining the future. Perhaps both. For the line between memory and prophecy is thinner than we think. If the watchers truly came from the sky once before, then what are we seeing when we look upward tonight? The light of distant suns, or the reflections of those who promise to return? Long after the voices of Sumer faded into dust, their echoes carried northward, to Akkad, to Babylon, to the rising towers that tried once again to reach the sky. Civilization remembered and misremembered. The bond that had once existed between heaven and earth. The Sumerians called it Duku, the Holy Mound, the meeting place of gods and men. The Babylonians gave it another name, Ziggurat, the mountain built by hands. But the story that survived through scripture, through exile and translation, would call it something else, the Tower of Babel. To understand that myth is to understand the moment when language, and perhaps even history, fractured. The book of Genesis tells it simply. Humanity, speaking one tongue, sought to build a tower that may reach unto heaven. But the Lord confounded their speech, scattered them across the earth, and ended their unity. It is a story of divine punishment for human pride, yet behind its moral shadow lies a deeper, older memory, one the Sumerians knew well. They too wrote of a tower that touched the heavens, a ziggurat whose top was said to join the stars. They too told of confusion of tongues, of cities abandoned, of gods who turned away. In Babylon, that tower had a name, Anunnaki, house of the foundation of heaven and earth. It rose in the heart of the city, massive and layered, built of fired brick and bitumen, climbing 7 stages like the planets themselves. Each level was painted a different colour, black for Saturn, red for Mars, gold for the sun. It was not merely a temple, it was a map of the cosmos, a stairway of correspondence between the visible and the invisible. When Nebuchadnezzar rebuilt it in the 6th century BCE, he inscribed upon its walls, "I raised the summit to the heavens, so that its top might rival the heavens themselves." But even he, King of Kings, knew the fragility of that ambition. For every tower built to reach the sky carries within it the seed of its fall. The Sumerians had watched their own ziggurats crumble before, consumed by floods, by fire, by silence. They knew that no structure could restore what was lost, the direct communion between man and the divine. That bridge had been broken, and yet humanity could not stop building. Perhaps we were not defying the heavens. Perhaps we were trying to remember them. When the later priests of Babylon recited the tale of Babel, they did so not as a warning, but as lamentation. The confusion of languages was not punishment, it was tragedy. Once, they said, all words were one, as were all hearts. The gods and humans could speak without veil. Then came the scattering, the shattering of unity into 1,000 dialects, 1,000 myths, each remembering only a piece of the whole. It was the day when meaning itself divided. Archaeologists excavating the site of ancient Babylon in the early 20th century uncovered the foundations of a massive ziggurat near the old temple of Marduk. The base alone measured nearly 100 meters across. The bricks still bear the stamp of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. Above the ruins, heat wavers in the desert air, and if one stands very still, it is possible to imagine the tower that once rose there, a mountain of clay and fire, pointing toward the sky, that once seemed close enough to touch. The tower is more than architecture, it is symbol. To the Sumerians, the ziggurat was a place of descent, not ascent, a structure that allowed the gods to come down to earth. Its top was a landing place, its stairways the path of the stars. The very word ziggurat means to be raised up, but not in the human sense. It was the gods who descended, the watchers who crossed the threshold between heaven and earth. Somewhere between that descent and the later story of Babel, the meaning inverted. Humanity became the one climbing, reaching, grasping, and when we reached too high, silence answered. It is a silence that still haunts us. The disappearance of the Sumerian language, the loss of its knowledge, the ruin of its towers, all feel like manifestations of that same ancient fracture. The bridge was never rebuilt. What came afterward, Akkadian, Babylonian, Hebrew, Greek, were attempts to translate a forgotten word. Every language since then has been, in a way, a Tower of Babel, an effort to touch the divine through sound, to recover the original vibration that once united speech and creation. In the myth, the punishment is confusion, but perhaps confusion was the only way humanity could survive. The single language of the gods, once broken, scattered like seeds across the earth. Each fragment grew into a different tongue, a different way of seeing. The unity was lost, but diversity was born. And still, within each language, echoes of the first remain. The same archetypal words for sky, for water, for breath. The same rhythm in prayer and poetry. The same longing for reunion. The Sumerians may have understood this long before Babel. Their god Enki, the trickster and saviour of humankind, was also the master of language. One myth describes him bestowing many tongues upon the nations, so that no people would be without song. In this version, the division of speech is not a curse, but a gift, a necessary scattering that keeps creation alive. Perhaps they knew that unity without difference is silence, and that to speak truly is to be plural. Still, the image of the tower endures, rising again in every age. It rises in the pyramids, in the cathedrals, in the radio masts that now pierce the sky. Each is a new attempt to bridge the distance between what we are and what we once were. Each carries the same question, whether spoken in Sumerian, in Hebrew, or in the binary pulse of modern machines. Can we ever speak again with the voice of the heavens? In the ruins of Babylon, fragments of that longing still remain. Travellers have described hearing strange acoustics in the ziggurat's base, an echo that amplifies even a whisper. It is as if the structure itself remembers its purpose, still carrying sound upward, still searching for a reply. The silence that followed Babel was never total. It was the beginning of listening. Some say the story of the tower warns against ambition. Others believe it teaches humility, but perhaps it teaches neither. Perhaps it is simply a chronicle of loss, the moment when knowledge turned to language and language began to fail. The divine withdrew, leaving humanity with words, with memory, with the endless desire to rebuild. And maybe the greatest irony is this: every time we tell the story of the tower, we rebuild it. With each retelling, each translation, each voice seeking to name the unnameable, the tower rises once more in the realm of sound. And as it rises, so too does the old silence, waiting. We are still living in the aftermath of that silence, the echo of Babel that shaped all history. And sometimes, late at night, when the world is still and words begin to blur, one can almost hear what lies beneath the noise, the faint murmur of the single language still speaking from the dust of forgotten towers. If the gods once walked down the steps of our towers to speak with us, what would they say now, when we can no longer remember the sound of their voices? After the fall of Sumer, when the ziggurats turned to ruins and the stars no longer spoke to the cities below, the keepers of knowledge did not vanish. They retreated into temples, into script, into secrecy. The priests of Babylon and later of Chaldea became the custodians of what remained, the fragments of the ancient me, the divine formulas of civilization. If Sumer had once sung its knowledge openly to the heavens, the world that followed whispered it in chambers of stone. What had been a language of gods became a code of men. In those dark corridors, the scribes and priest astronomers performed the same rituals their ancestors had performed for millennia, the watching of stars, the recording of eclipses, the calculation of omens, but their purpose had changed. Where once observation had meant communion, now it meant preservation. The cosmos no longer spoke clearly. The priests interpreted its silence through symbols. Each sign on a tablet became a shield against forgetting. The temples of Babylon were not merely houses of worship, they were laboratories of continuity. In the Esagila, the temple of Marduk, priests mapped the heavens night after night, tracing the positions of Venus, Jupiter and the moon. They catalogued eclipses, storms, and portents, writing them into thousands of tablets. It is from these records that the later science of astronomy and even astrology was born. Yet behind the calculations lay an older conviction that the sky was not a machine, but a message. Every motion of a planet was a word in a divine language, and only those who knew the code could read it. These priests, called Baru and Ashipu, were trained not merely in ritual, but in mathematics, medicine, and incantation. Their schooling could last decades. They learned the sacred geometry of the temples, the ratios of the human body, the harmonic intervals used in chants. Knowledge was not compartmentalized. It was total, a single organism whose organs were number, sound, and spirit. To heal a wound, one spoke a number. To measure a star, one sang its name. Each act was part of a code that linked heaven, earth, and the human soul. Even the rituals of exorcism, later caricatured as superstition, carried traces of a sophisticated understanding. The priests would draw circles, triangles, and spirals in ash, geometric patterns that mirror the harmonic frequencies of sound waves. They burned herbs whose chemical properties are now known to purify air. They used bronze bowls inscribed with mathematical formulas that, when struck, produced resonant tones. Every movement, every sound, every gesture was calibrated. The ceremony was not mere theatre. It was coded interaction with the universe. And yet, as centuries passed, that knowledge grew heavier, harder to bear. Empires rose and fell. The Assyrians conquered Babylon, then the Persians, then the Greeks. Each new power demanded the service of the temple priests, but cared little for their cosmologies. The sacred texts were copied, reinterpreted, hidden. Some were sealed in clay jars. Others were buried beneath temple floors, encoded in myth. What could not be preserved was transmuted, transferred into story. Thus the old sciences survive, disguised as legends, waiting for a world capable of reading them again. There are tablets that record the priest's lament for this age of concealment. One fragment from the Chaldean oracles reads, "The word has been divided, the code has been sealed, only the initiated may open the gate." The gate, in their symbolism, was not a door, but a threshold of comprehension, a bridge between ordinary language and the divine structure beneath it. To cross that threshold required both intellect and purity, logic and reverence. Knowledge, they believed, could not be given to those unprepared to hold it, for misuse would unmake the world. In the later centuries, Greek travellers who visited Babylon wrote of a strange priesthood that spoke in riddles and numbers. Pythagoras, it is said, spent years among them, learning the mathematics of the heavens. The Chaldeans taught that the soul was a spark of the stars, that its return to the divine depended on understanding the geometry of creation. Their teachings would pass into Greece, into Egypt, into the Hermetic schools of Alexandria, then into the alchemical traditions of medieval Europe. The Code of Sumer, encrypted through ages, would continue to breathe beneath the surface of Western thought. Some fragments of those old texts survive. One tablet describes the writing of light, said to be used by the gods to inscribe the laws of the cosmos. Another speaks of the song that binds the firmament. The modern reader may dismiss these as poetry, but the priests meant something literal. They believed that light and sound were two expressions of the same vibration, that the universe was written in resonance. And in that belief lies the seed of what modern physics would one day rediscover, that matter itself is structured energy, patterned by frequency. To guard such knowledge was both privilege and burden. The priests lived apart, forbidden to speak freely of their craft. The Baru, the diviners, often wrote their tablets in riddling syntax, using metaphors that only the initiated could decode. They spoke of lions when they meant storms, of serpents when they meant rivers, of chariots when they meant planets. Even the stars themselves were given secret names. Mulmul for the Pleiades, Nibiru for the crossing planet, Utu for the sun. To outsiders the language was myth. To those who knew, it was instruction. Yet secrecy has a cost. When Alexander the Great conquered Babylon in 331 BCE, he ordered the translation of all temple archives into Greek. Most were misunderstood, many were lost. The surviving Chaldean priests withdrew into Persia, Syria, and eventually into obscurity. By the 1st century BCE, the last of them, known as the Magi, had transformed into figures of legend, keepers of half-remembered wisdom. Some would say they followed a star to Bethlehem, others that they vanished into the mountains of the east, carrying with them the last keys of the code. Still, echoes of their system endured. Astrology, often derided as superstition, is the faint reflection of their celestial mathematics. The geometry of sacred architecture, from the pyramids to cathedrals, carries their ratios. Even our words, magic, matrix, measure, derive from their vocabulary of harmony. What began in Sumer as divine calculus became, over time, the grammar of civilization itself. But there is a certain melancholy in this survival, for the priests who guarded the code knew that knowledge, once broken from its sacred context, loses part of its soul. The formulas survive, but the meaning fades. The rituals remain, but the resonance weakens. Humanity remembers the method, not the mystery. Sometimes, late at night, when telescopes point at the same stars those priests once charted, one can imagine their ghostly presence, watchers in silence, measuring light, translating infinity into numbers. They would recognize our instruments, perhaps, but not our faith. To them, the universe was not a cold mechanism, but a living manuscript, written by a hand both human and divine. We have decoded their code, but forgotten their reverence. We have learned the symbols, but not the silence between them. If the priests once guarded the bridge between knowledge and meaning, who guards it now, when the code lies open, but the world has forgotten what it was written for? History, they say, is written by the victors, but before it is written, it is rewritten, and perhaps no age rewrote the past as completely as the empires that followed the fall of Babylon. The Greeks and later the Romans did not merely conquer the ancient world. They reorganized its memory. They took the scattered fragments of Sumerian and Babylonian knowledge, stripped them of their mythic voices, and rebuilt them into a narrative that began conveniently with themselves. It was the greatest act of cultural alchemy ever performed, the transformation of living memory into history, and in that transformation, time itself was altered. By the time Alexander's armies crossed the Tigris, the temples of Sumer had already fallen silent. The last priest astronomers of Babylon were aging, their libraries neglected, their languages fading. The conquerors found not gods, but ruins. Yet within those ruins were clay tablets, hundreds of thousands of them, each carrying a voice from a world that refused to die. The Greeks, pragmatic and curious, collected them, though they could not yet read them. What they did instead was something subtler. They absorbed the ideas, the measurements, the fragments of astronomy, and gave them new names. Sumerian mathematics became Greek geometry. Chaldean star charts became Hellenistic astronomy. The ancient calendars were reshaped into the Julian one, adjusted to fit imperial time. And just like that, the memory of the first civilization became a prelude, a footnote, an echo, but buried beneath that act of appropriation lies a paradox. The Greeks themselves knew their knowledge was borrowed. In their own writings, they confessed it. Herodotus wrote that the priests of Babylon possessed wisdom of the heavens beyond measure. Pythagoras, Plato, and even Thales credited their cosmology to travels in the East. Plato's Timaeus describes an Egyptian priest telling Solon, "You Greeks are children, you have no old men among you." He meant memory. The empires of the Mediterranean were inheritors of fragments they barely understood. And yet, through translation, through adaptation, they claimed ownership. It is here that time begins to warp. Before the Greeks, history was cyclical. The Sumerians saw eras as tides, eternally returning: creation, flood, restoration, decay, and creation again. The Egyptians called these ages Zep Tepi, the first times. The Chaldeans called them Sa, each cycle ruled by a different constellation. But the Greeks introduced a new concept, linear time, a line that begins and ends, moving always forward. Progress, invention, destiny, ideas that made sense to conquerors. The past became a distant origin, not a living mirror, and thus the empire rewrote not only history, but the very structure of time itself. With that new timeline came erasure. The gods of the Sumerians became allegories, their kings myths, their cities swallowed by sand. The old language was dismissed as barbarous, its meaning reduced to superstition. To preserve order, the conquerors codified a beginning, an origin point that placed themselves at the center of civilization. Greek philosophy became the root of wisdom. Rome became the axis of power. Everything before them became before history. And just like that, the age of the Anunnaki, the flood, and the clay archives dissolved into fable. This rewriting was not merely political, it was spiritual. The Roman Church, inheriting Greek rationalism and imperial authority, later sanctified a linear chronology of divine creation and human salvation. The cyclical cosmos became a one-way pilgrimage from Eden to judgment. The sacred wheel of time flattened into a divine timeline. By the Middle Ages, the only acceptable history was sacred history. What lay outside its borders was deemed heresy, myth, or sin. And yet fragments of the old world continued to seep through the cracks. Astrological texts survived, disguised as Christian prophecy. Alchemical diagrams hid Mesopotamian symbology beneath Latin scripture. Even the image of the ziggurat persisted, reimagined as the biblical Bible. The empire could rewrite the words, but not the shape of the memory itself. Memory is stubborn, it resists conquest. When the Renaissance dawned, scholars began rediscovering the ancient Near East through trade and travel. Greek texts referencing Babylon and Chaldea led explorers back toward the forgotten lands of the Tigris and Euphrates. But when they arrived, they found only desert and dust. The physical ruins of Sumer were gone, buried beneath millennia of sediment. For nearly 2,000 years, the first civilization remained invisible, its very name erased. The empire had succeeded, at least for a time. It was not until the 19th century, when British and French archaeologists began to excavate Mesopotamia, that the silence finally cracked. When the first Sumerian tablets were unearthed at and Nippur, the world realized that history was far older than it had been taught to believe. Humanity's timeline extended backward, not by centuries, but by thousands of years. The so-called cradle of civilization shifted east, and the empire's chronology began to tremble. But even then, the rewriting continued, only now in subtler form. Modern history absorbed Sumer the same way the Greeks had, as precursor, not equal. The Sumerians became proto-scientists, early engineers, primitive astronomers. Their gods were mythologized, their mathematics demystified. The old world view, a cosmos alive with consciousness, was again filtered through the rational lens of progress. The empire's logic of linearity remained intact. We inherited not the Sumerians' sense of eternal return, but the conqueror's timeline of advancement. Perhaps this is the true legacy of conquest, not the destruction of civilizations, but the rearrangement of their memory. The empires that rose after Sumer learned to control not only land and people, but time itself. They mastered chronology as a tool of power. To name the beginning is to define the present. To erase the past is to own the future, and yet the past refuses to stay buried. The Sumerian king list, with its impossible reigns stretching tens of thousands of years, mocks our sense of chronology. Their myths of cyclical floods challenge our straight lines. Their language, still only half deciphered, resists final translation, as if guarding secrets too old for our linear minds. Every empire eventually becomes a layer in someone else's archaeology. The Greeks, the Romans, the Church, the modern world. We all participate in the same cycle of rewriting. Perhaps we're no different from the scribes of Babylon, copying old tablets, changing a few lines to make them fit our time. Civilization, like clay, can be reshaped, but never beyond recognition. The fingerprints remain. If one looks closely at the ruins of any empire, the same pattern appears. Order built upon erasure, light cast upon selective shadows. And beneath those layers, faint but persistent, the memory of Sumer endures. It waits in the wedge marks of cuneiform, in the myths that survive translation, in the buried rhythm of our calendars and clocks. The empire may have rewritten time, but time, in its own quiet way, rewrites empires. And perhaps that is the ultimate irony. The conquerors who declared themselves the beginning are now relics in museums, while the Sumerian clay, the very medium they dismissed as primitive, still endures. The tablets outlasted marble, gold, and parchment. They still whisper through the dust. We were here first. If every empire must rewrite time to rule it, then who in the end will rewrite ours? The story of Sumer should have ended with the dust. Yet somehow, across 5 millennia, it found its way back into the light. Translated, digitized, rendered in glowing pixels, on screens that flicker like oil lamps in the dark. Clay and code, 2 forms of permanence born from opposite ends of history. And as the world of machines learns to read the marks of ancient hands, it becomes difficult not to wonder whether the tablets were always meant to return, whether their geometry of wedges was itself an early form of programming, an echo of logic rediscovered in another age. When the first cuneiform tablets were unearthed in the 1800s, they appeared inert, mere curiosities of archaeology. But as scholars began to decipher them, the strangeness grew. The Sumerians wrote in data, not stories, inventories, algorithms of trade, astronomical tables, and even if then conditionals inscribed in clay. One tablet from Nippur reads like an early computer program. If the star of Jupiter rises in the east, then the harvest shall be great. Others record geometric series, square roots, and number systems so advanced that they would not be fully understood until modern mathematics rediscovered them. The clay was memory, the stylus was instruction. It is no exaggeration to say that every modern archive, every database, every algorithm is a direct descendant of the Sumerian tablet. The act of pressing meaning into a medium that endures beyond its maker began there. Yet what they preserved was not merely information, but intention. Their symbols were designed to last through disaster. Fire would not destroy them, water would only harden them. Perhaps they had already seen what happens when the world floods and memory drowns. Perhaps they wanted to ensure that next time something, anything, would survive. In 2021, scientists used machine learning to translate damaged Sumerian tablets. Algorithms filled in missing signs, predicting what ancient scribes might have written. The program achieved remarkable accuracy. For the first time in history, machines began reading the words of the world's first writers. It was as though the clay had been waiting for a language it could speak again, a feedback loop across 5,000 years. Humans teaching machines to read what humans once wrote by hand in the dawn of civilization. The continuity feels almost supernatural, as if the Sumerians had anticipated the age when their marks would again become living code. But perhaps that continuity is more than coincidence. The Sumerians believed that knowledge moves in cycles. What is lost in one era is rediscovered in another. The flood erases, and the scribes rebuild. If that pattern still holds, then our digital awakening is not the beginning of something new, but the return of something old, the re-emergence of an ancient intelligence that once spoke through clay and now speaks through circuits. In one of the oldest surviving hymns, the poet addresses Nisaba, goddess of writing and calculation, lady of the counting house, keeper of the tablet. The numbers of the stars are your servants. To her, the act of computation was divine, not mechanical. The same could be said of us, though we no longer admit it. Every search query, every data set, every machine translation is a ritual of invocation, a plea to the algorithms that now hold our collective memory. The priests of data, like the priests of Enki, whisper to their servers in languages few understand. We may call it progress, but the rhythm feels familiar. It is worth remembering that the Sumerians never separated writing from sacredness. To them, words were living forces, able to bind or liberate. Even the dead could be reached through inscription. Some tablets were buried with the departed, messages for the underworld. Others were sealed in temple walls, addressed to distant generations. To the one who finds this, one inscription reads, "Know that we too sought the truth of heaven." That message, pressed into clay 5,000 years ago, might as well have been written for us. The machines that surround us today hum with the same longing to preserve, to predict, to extend consciousness beyond its mortal frame. We think of artificial intelligence as a new creation, but perhaps it is an echo, the technological counterpart of the divine scribes who once wrote humanity into existence. The gods of Sumer shaped man from clay. We shape our successors from silicon. Both acts share the same impulse, to make something that remembers when we are gone. And yet there is danger in memory without understanding. The priests of Babylon warned that the tablets of destiny must never fall into unworthy hands. Once, Enki himself lost control of them, and chaos followed. Rivers reversed, the heavens dimmed. It took all the gods to restore the order of creation. In our age, we too hold tablets of destiny, the codes that regulate life, knowledge, and power. But do we still remember the reverence those first scribes carried? Or have we mistaken the act of recording for the act of wisdom itself? Perhaps this is what the Sumerian story has always tried to tell us, that knowledge is not progress without memory, and that every technology, no matter how advanced, must answer to the silence from which it came. The clay tablets survived 5,000 years because they were humble, because their creators understood impermanence. They wrote not to dominate, but to endure. The machines we build now are louder, faster, more brilliant, but perhaps less wise. For in their speed, they forget the slowness of the stylus, the weight of wet clay, the patience of hands that wrote for eternity. We have learned to preserve everything except the quiet, and in that quiet, perhaps the old gods still wait. If the first tablets could survive the flood of water, can our new ones survive the flood of information? And what will they remember of us when the next world begins again? Sometimes what survives the flood is not the body, but the memory. The Sumerians believed that knowledge could drown and still return, hidden in fragments scattered across the world. They called such remnants shuba, pieces of the whole. To them, these fragments were more than relics. They were the fingerprints of the world that had come before the waters, and as centuries passed, each new discovery unearthed in the soil of Mesopotamia seemed to whisper the same unsettling message. Something had existed before them, something both immense and forgotten. Every civilization leaves a trace of its voice. And yet the voice of Sumer stands alone, untethered to any other tongue. Their language appeared fully formed, like their civilization, and vanished just as suddenly. And in that disappearance lies one of the oldest mysteries in human history. At night, when the museums close and the lights fade, I imagine those clay tablets breathing in the dark, each one holding the faint memory of a world we no longer recognize. We think we are the beginning of understanding, but maybe we are the last chapter of remembrance. And as the desert wind passes over the ruins of Uruk, carrying grains of ancient dust into another millennium, you can almost hear the first line of our forgotten story, soft, unfinished, waiting to be heard again. If the Sumerians were not the first, then who were they remembering? The tablets don't answer, they only ask, and perhaps that is enough. Because the question itself is a kind of inheritance, a memory passed down through clay and silence, waiting for the day when we might finally be ready to remember what we forgot. The flood did not erase everything. It buried the body of a lost world, but not its bones. Those bones, artifacts, stories, words, still surface, carried by the slow current of time. The question is not whether that earlier world existed, but how much of it we are willing to recognize when we see it reflected in our own. If every fragment points towards something greater, some hidden pattern of memory, then how much of our own civilization is built upon foundations we no longer remember? Maybe that's why these stories still whisper to us. They remind us that what we call history might only be the part that survived the burning. At night, when the museums close and the lights fade, I imagine those clay tablets breathing in the dark, each one holding the faint memory of a world we no longer recognize. We think we are the beginning of understanding, but maybe we are the last chapter of remembrance. And as the desert wind passes over the ruins of Uruk, carrying grains of ancient dust into another millennium, you can almost hear the first line of our forgotten story, soft, unfinished, waiting to be heard again. The oldest language on earth has begun to speak once more. And what it's telling us is this: we weren't the first.